Ladies and gentlemen, guests, good evening and a very warm welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. You may all sit. I'm Nairi Woods and I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, and it's my great pleasure tonight not just to welcome all of you to the school, a welcome on behalf of the many students and faculty and staff who are here with us, but to introduce Professor Sir Paul Collier. Paul has been at Oxford for a few years now, so you might wonder why we're having an inaugural lecture by Paul Collier this evening. And it's because Paul is one of the foundations of this School of Government. He was the first professorship that we appointed to this school, and we appointed Paul not because he was about to be knighted by the realm, not because he was about to be awarded the Presidential Medal of the British Academy, not because his books have had the most astonishing success around the world in educating people, but for three deeper reasons that underpin all of that success. And the first of those is the insatiable curiosity that took Paul from Sheffield, where he grew up, to rural Tanzania to try to work out and understand what poverty is. I only got to know Paul when he'd become a formidable, some told me scary, economist at Oxford. And it was sitting in the Kampala Club in Kampala, Uganda, that an elderly Tanzanian policymaker said to me, "So you know Paul Collier?" Well, I remember when he was a young lad, odd character walking around in his sandals, determined to collect all the data that we didn't have and didn't know about so that he could explain to us what was happening in our own country. And that's the first really important reason and impetus that Paul brings to this new School of Government. And the second is his well-known desire and insatiable habit of turning orthodoxy upside down, of using a very fertile mind to challenge right to the core of questions. And I saw it really up close when I was investigating for the IMF how they evaluate their policies. And there was one evaluation that stood out, and it was dismissed by some economists as poorly organized. And they completely missed the point. It was the only evaluation that really had impact. And that's because Paul led a group of researchers, and they didn't faff around with, well, did this person do what they said they'd do? He said, hold on, this whole rather complicated program is aimed at trying to increase investment into these countries. Did it succeed? And the answer was no. And that caused everybody to gasp and go back to the drawing board and start again. And it was the only evaluation at that time that actually did that. So that passion and desire to turn things on their head, which is so important for all of us as students of government. And the third is just this fantastic capacity that Paul has. And he's not good at listening to praise, so don't worry, don't look at him blushing on the sidelines, but a really extraordinary capacity to take complex issues and to sit with a minister, not patronizing them, not arrogantly telling them that really they should understand how complicated the world is and that if they'd only read the 15 important journal articles, they wouldn't be asking this question. Never. I remember sitting with Paul and an Indonesian minister of energy and there was only 15 minutes. And this poor minister had been absolutely overwhelmed with advice and academics and advisors and consultants. And Paul just sat calmly and said, "Minister, there's only 4 things that really matter. And here is what they are." And she literally could write them on the back of his business card. It got right to the nub so beautifully clearly, but also with such empathy for the policymaker, understanding that that's the clarity that they needed. So for all those reasons, Paul is a huge part of the foundations of this Blavatnik School of Government, and I am delighted, now that we've moved into our own home, to introduce Paul to give his inaugural lecture as Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the Blavatnik School of Government.
Well, thank you for coming on such a lousy evening. I'll do my best to say something that makes it worthwhile. I've been a professor here for 24 years. I thought I was going to get away with it, you know, but no. Our alarming dean made sure of that. Now, my subject is rather curious subject. It's the ideas and stories that circulate in a group of people form or can form into mental constructs held by those people, and those mental constructs can become dysfunctional for the group. And finally, even though they're dysfunctional, they can be highly persistent. So that's the territory we're going to cover. The group may be very small, like a family. Family is a small group of people that interacts as mental constructs build up, and those mental constructs can pass down the generations. There's a brilliant new book called The Sun Also Rises, S-O-N, by Gregory Clark. And what he shows, using rare surnames, is that success and extraordinary failure passed down generation through generation, actually over centuries. And he's puzzled as to why does that persistence of extreme success, extreme failure happen? And he narrows it down to two things. He says, I can't choose between them. It could be genetics. It seems unlikely when you're going for 2 or 3 centuries. If it's not that, it's culture. So that's a very small group, the family. Or we can move to a bigger group, an organization, such as a firm or a school. There's a marvelous study by Rebecca Henderson at Harvard Business School on General Motors. And when the story starts, General Motors, this is the mid-1960s, and General Motors is the most successful company there has ever been on the planet. So it's done something right. And then between the mid-60s and 2009, it dies in slow motion. By 2009, it's gone bankrupt. And we know, because it was such an important company, we know exactly what killed it, because there were consultants crawling all over it, paid a fortune to discover what was happening. It was killed by Toyota. And the reason it was killed was because of its culture. Its culture, which had been highly functional, sufficiently functional fit for the most profitable company that had ever existed, its culture was disastrous when in competition with Toyota. After a couple of decades, the senior management of General Motors actually worked it out that it was their culture which was killing them and tried to change the culture. They couldn't change it in time. That culture was so persistent, they didn't know how to change it. So, culture seems to matter for extreme dysfunction at the level of the family and at the level of the organization. If we can move up to a bigger group, we get to a whole society. Can culture trap a whole society into dysfunction that becomes persistent? We can think of extreme cultural differences between societies. Some societies which have a high degree of mutual regard amongst the population Others, a high degree of mutual hatred among the population, so that's one dimension of difference. Another, little bit more subtle, is does the society think of Eden as having happened in the past or in the future? If you're in Silicon Valley, it's quite clear which direction Eden lies. If you're ISIS trying to restore the 11th century caliphate, Eden lies temporally in the other direction. So big cultural differences like that. These things add up to differences in the degree of generosity, the willingness of people to cooperate, degrees of trust, and even differences in savings rates, which play out in economic consequences. But social science has been scared off thinking of cultural explanations for the persistence of poverty at the national level, and for good reason. And that's because those explanations have got a deplorable record. I suppose the funniest is the explanation of why China would never develop. It was stuck in Confucianism, right? Obviously comic, right? Given what happened. Instead, social science, when it looks at extreme dysfunction at the national level, has ended up with a rational choice-based explanation, which my friend Robert Bates was instrumental in building. And it's essentially, it runs like this, that persistent poverty in a society is explained by dysfunctional policies, and the dysfunctional policies are explained because policies set by narrow elites which set policies so as to benefit themselves at the expense of the larger group. Now, that is clearly a pretty sensible explanation. We can think of many, many societies in which that's true. But here's two caveats. One is that when we get to extreme dysfunction, say something like the Central African Republic, there's so much potential gain from different strategies that it gets harder and harder to tell the story of this is dysfunctional because of elite self-interest. And secondly, there's a certain degree of economy in using the same explanation at the level of the family, the organization, and the society. The size of group, in principle, shouldn't matter. If we're to build, as it were, cultural explanations alongside the rational choice elite self-interest, not as a rival, but as a supplement, if so, to avoid the mistakes of last time, things like Confucianism as an explanation, we need to embed these theories within a rational choice framework. So it's not an alternative to rational choice, it's just within rational choice. Now, since the rational choice theory of economics was developed about 100 years ago, and it's based upon the idea of utility maximization, there have been big advances in social psychology. And economics is starting to use those advances. For example, it's now standard in economics to accept that there are decision biases hardwired into people, hardwired through an evolutionary process. And that's exemplified in the fast thinking that Daniel Kahneman has analyzed. But that time scale of evolutionary change is hundreds of thousands of years. What I'm going to suggest is something that's not hardwired in our brains, but is soft-wired. it's cultural decision biases that may be persistent for a few generations. So it's a different time scale from the hardwired. What I'm going to talk about has a huge debt to George Akerlof and Rachel Crampton. This is what I'm presenting is an extension of their identity economics, which they've pioneered over the last 15 years. Economics is a very conservative subject, and so it's very resistant to change. So I'm going to use a little analogy, because the one subject that economists really envy is physics. Now, the physics we envy is classical physics. It's basically classical mechanics that, just as classical mechanics thought about billiard balls, in classical economics, the people are the billiard balls, right? And the force that's acting on them is greed. Right? Classical mechanics about a century ago got overthrown or supplemented by quantum mechanics. And that change was very, very deeply resisted around a century ago. And there were two transformations from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. You didn't realize this was going to be a lecture in quantum physics, but here it goes. So one transformation was that we moved from a world of things to a world of interactions. Stuff only comes into existence in quantum mechanics through interactions. And the second component of quantum mechanics, the second big idea, is stuff comes in packages, quanta. As it happens, purely by chance, we need rather similar new ideas in economics. So the new identity economics is actually going to make those two changes. One is, instead of the billiard balls of individuals, we're going to replace the billiard balls of individuals as the primary units of analysis with interaction between the billiard balls. Interaction, social interaction, is going to be the primary phenomenon. And secondly, we're going to move on from individual bits of stuff to packages of stuff, the quantum. And the packages are going to be packages of mental constructs that, in equilibrium, stick together. So, groups are primary. We're going to take that first step in identity economics. It's not the individual, it's the group that matters. Why is it that the group is primary and not the individual? Because people are born into groups, they're reared in groups, their membership of groups is path dependent depending on which group they start in, and people acquire their mental constructs from those groups well before they develop the capacity for rational thought. I spend my spare time reading social psychology, and apparently rational thought sets in at 14. I've got 3 kids that span between 9 and 16, and I don't see any sign of it yet, but I can well believe that it's not before 14. Right? By the age of 14, you've got a lot of mental constructs. What do we mean by mental constructs? Which ones? Well, first and foremost, identity economics is called identity economics because one thing you acquire is a sense of identity. Having an identity is a basic need. We think of our identity as very individual, but the only meaning we can give to our identity is in terms of groups. If you think about it, if you challenge yourself, when you come to say who you really are, you're giving a set of groups. What beyond identity? Norms. Norms are how your peers in the group judge you. In addition to norms, values. Values are, in effect, internalized norms. And finally, narratives. Narratives are a fancy word for stories. And stories or narratives turn out to be how most people learn most about how they think the world works. If this, then that. The causal relations which we try and maximize against, we understand predominantly through stories related to us, narrated within our group networks. Why are narratives so important as a source of information? This has been explored in neuroscience, and the answer is, at least in part, because narratives are very easy to remember. I spend my life trying to teach analytic information, and the stuff that students remember over the years is the stories with which I deck out the analysis. So that's evidenced by Paul Zak. So, how does all this change the classical rational choice analysis? Well, one thing that changes is how people generate utility. In the classical economics, there's only one way that people generate utility, and that is by consuming goods. The greedy individual. And that's not foolish, but it's just too limited. It's like pretending that there's only one force out there in the physical world. And we now know there's a lot more than one force. It's not just billiard balls. And so, what else generates utility? Well, if we draw in some social psychology into identity economics, we know that one thing that really, really matters to people is the esteem of their peers. And if I talk with my children, frankly, yes, they want a bit of stuff, you know, little bits of electronics. But what they really talk about when they come home is what their peers have done and said about them during the day. How do you get peer esteem? You conform to the norms of your peers. You enact things which conform with those norms. What else matters apart from peer esteem? Self-esteem. How do you get self-esteem? You enact the values that you have internalized. What else? Well-being of others. You care about the well-being of others. Which others? Well, here's where identity plays quite big. Within the groups that you identify with, people with shared identity, there's good evolutionary reasons why you care about their well-being as well as your own. Whether that extends to other groups and how it extends to other groups, very different between different societies. Whether you positively care for other groups or sufficiently hate other groups that you actually are willing to reduce your own utility in order to reduce theirs. And there's good recent evidence that in some societies that sort of behavior is common. So that's all new forces, ways in which people get utility. And then there's ways in which people learn about the world. In the classical economics, there's only one way in which people learn about the world, and that is direct observation. You look at the world, you observe it, and that gives you an error correction process. If you initially think it's wrong, something happens that you didn't expect, and you in a sort of Bayesian process of updating, you gradually asymptote towards getting it right. With identity economics, as you've heard, that sort of learning process is trumped by, direct observation is trumped by narratives. Right? An interesting word, trumped. So, where have we got to? My God, I've managed to use it. This is a summary of sort of where we got to. I'll not spend any time on it, but the primary thing is the social networks. The social networks are generating your identity. How? Through copying role models. They're generating the narratives. They're narrated around the group. And they're generating the norms. That's the standards your peers will judge you by. The norms and the narratives impose constraints on how you think the world will work and what you think you can get away with. The identities may set the preferences. Then you're maximizing subject to these perceived. So all this maximizing stuff is still as in classical world, but the stuff below it is new. You get outcomes. If we're talking about a really dysfunctional group, the outcomes are lousy. And so what ought to happen is an error correction process. Now, in classical economics, the error correction would go straight to the individual. They'd revise their perceived constraints. But in this world, the error correction has to run through the social networks. And that might work, but it depends on what happens in those social networks. The next step in the analysis, so far we've said social groups are primary, not individuals. Right? Remember that other bit of quantum mechanics, the quanta, things cluster together. We're now going to go to that stage and see why this clustering together is going to negate that error correction mechanism. Right? So that's what we do next. And mental constructs cluster into packages through two distinct processes. One is within the individual brain. What's sitting in your brain, according to this, is an identity, some norms, some values that you've internalized from some of those norms, and some narratives that you've heard and accepted. And that identity, norms, values, and narratives in equilibrium are going to cohere. The reason they're going to cohere is that you're going to try and avoid cognitive dissonance. And so random packages of this is my identity, and here's a norm, and here's a set of narratives, don't persist in equilibrium. Right? Just to give you you're going to have to do a lot of work yourselves in this lecture, but here's something to be thinking about. Imagine the mental world of Florence Nightingale. Right? There's her identity. There's a set of norms. There's a set of narratives she tells herself, a set of values that she's internalized. And now imagine that a different mental world, namely that of Al Capone. Right? All four components are going to be really quite different. But in each case, they cohere. Al Capone doesn't spend his day agonizing over cognitive dissonance. His norms and his narratives fit with his identity and his values, if you see. Now, imagine that some potentially disruptive information comes along, a bad outcome. Right? And that potentially challenges one of Al Capone's norms. Right? Does he change the norm? Well, changing the norm would push him into severe cognitive dissonance. And so he's going to try and resist accepting that norm. He's going to try and look for some ways of avoiding the cognitive dissonance. You know, if the cognitive dissonance gets big enough and the disruptive information big enough, it will overwhelm the whole package, and he'll switch perhaps to becoming Florence Nightingale, right? But locally, these mental constructs are stable. It will take a big push to turn Al Capone into Florence Nightingale. Right? So that's one stuff, is what's going on in the individual brain. And then we have the same stuff within a social network. Those same identities, narratives, norms, values within a social network will tend to look rather similar across individuals. Right? And so they'll, in equilibrium, they'll cohere. Al Capone will be part of a gang of lookalike Al Capones. Florence Nightingale similarly. Right? What do they do when potentially disruptive information comes along? Well, I've already suggested the nasty cognitive dissonance starts to be generated here. Here's some potentially disruptive information. Here's a little network, right? Little social network. It's a stylized network. There's one nodal actor. Everybody communicates with the nodal actor communicates with everybody else. Right? It doesn't have to be like that. He's just taking an example. Here's the potentially disruptive information. This guy hears it. He tells the nodal actor. Right? What does the nodal actor do? Well, the nodal actor could decide this is really potentially disruptive. I won't tell the others. That's filtering the information out. Right? Taboos work like that, both at the network level and at the individual level. People literally shut themselves out from hearing potentially disruptive information. That's what a taboo is. Right? It protects the investment in identity. It protects you from cognitive dissonance. Or suppose the potentially disruptive information is big enough that, damn it, everybody hears it. A nodal actor can still do something about it. They can put out a counter proposition. They can try and neutralize. For example, there might be sensational information that everybody hears. And the nodal actor might try and discredit the source of the information. I'm afraid I can't think of a current practical example. What I'm sketching here is working towards, as it were, a formal definition of persistent dysfunction. It's when the force of the potentially disruptive information is too weak to overcome the internal forces that are locking people in to their mental constructs. Now, it's high time that I said something about public policy. And so let me try and do so. There seem to me to be two key implications for public policy when we move from classical economics to identity economics. One is that in classical economics, there's a very, very powerful proposition. Now, it's got qualifications and limitations, and we're all aware of it, but that is the proposition that market forces, the invisible hand, will guide self-interested behavior into social efficiency. And unlikely as that proposition sounds, it is true to a first approximation, subject to qualifications. Social efficiency is not the same as social optimality, and so on and so forth, but it's a very, very powerful result. Understanding that result is what distinguishes economists from non-economists, I think. When we move from classical economics to identity economics, there is no equivalent to that invisible hand. There is no equivalent force, analogous to markets, that guides identities, norms, narratives, networks, values to social efficiency. They can be stuck in extreme social inefficiency and persist there. So that's the first implication. There is no equivalent to the invisible hand once we've moved out of the world of classical economics. Now, if I just go back for a moment, there's this much more complicated world of identity economics, and Oxford is the place that came up with Occam's razor. Avoid unnecessary complexity. Very important principle. Do we need all this stuff? And I want to say, most of the time, we don't. Just as, usually, in physics, you can get away with classical mechanics. It's good enough. If you just want to understand how to play billiards, all you need is classical mechanics. Quantum mechanics has nothing to add. But if you want to understand a computer, classical mechanics isn't going to help you at all. Most social interaction, most social behavior, classical economics is good enough. The force of greed allied to incentives, that's good enough most of the time. But it's not good enough in the range of the minority range, I think, of severe social dysfunction. That is a minority of situations, but when we come to public policy, it may well be a majority of public policy issues, because it's the dysfunction which looms very large in public policy. And so, do we need this extra complexity? Yes, I think we do, in quite a lot of public policy issues. So, we need public policy to guide the evolution of mental constructs. That sounds scary, but I think there's no alternative. Then the question becomes, what instruments do we have in public policy to do that? And the answer is, they're pretty new ones. A lot of them are pretty new ones. I'm going to go through four. One is, if narratives matter, we better learn how to use them. The public sector needs to learn, and politicians need to learn how to use narratives to shape mental constructs so that they are as socially functional as possible. The second is, can public policy change people's identities? Again, that sounds really scary. Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, he became president, he said, I've not got a country. I've got 50 tribes. And he spent his first year not actually functioning as president, just going round Tanzania trying to tell people, you're Tanzanian now. And then he adopted a range of policies to try and gradually reshape identity from a purely tribal one to a national one. A few years ago, social scientists got to rigorously evaluating that, and they found that it worked. It had worked. Because across the border in Kenya, you've got the same tribes, but subject to a different narrative, different set of policies over a long period, and so the ability to cooperate across tribes was much higher in Tanzania than in Kenya. We've also got evidence more recently that Paul Kagame has managed to reverse the disastrous effect of Radio Mille Collines and gradually build a sense of shared identity. If we're going to change identities, or try and change identities, what we need especially is new role models. Can the public sector do anything to introduce new role models? Let me take an example. The single most important behavioral group to change in most poor societies is young girls. If we could change the views of young girls from seeing themselves as what is their life narrative, instead of the life narrative being, I'm a child and then a mother, if it could be, I'm a schoolgirl and then that leads me into a job. Okay? That would be transformational for societies. Can we do that through getting role models that disseminate new identities and new narratives? I see we've got the chief economist of DFID in the audience. Let me put an idea, an implication of this lecture to him. What DFID should be doing is moving budget from building school buildings into, let me suggest it, right? You should be subsidizing girl bands. Wouldn't that be a good idea? It would be much cheaper and you'd have the same effect. Why don't you go to DFID and suggest it? You can set new public norms. We've just seen one being set. That was smart. You remember? What was smart? That was smart, avoiding all tax. From the incumbent, the future president of America, right? And that's setting a new norm, right? We can predict what that will tend to do to US tax revenues. Right? Finally, you can change networks. You can change participation in networks. A good example that my dean is keen on talking about is greater integration in schools across ethnic or religious groups. That's why it's not necessarily a wonderful idea to introduce and encourage religiously segmented schools. Who has used these new techniques best? Let me suggest which organization has really used these new tools of identity, narratives, nodal actors best. It's called ISIS. That's why it was so wildly successful so fast. Right? It learned how to use these new techniques. Right? Obviously, we need to use the same techniques to counter it, but it's a demonstration of how powerful these techniques can be. How do they interact with the public policy tools suggested by classical economics, the carrots and the sticks? And the answer is the interactions are quite ambiguous. Sometimes reinforcing an attempt to, say, change identity or change norms by incentives will help. Sometimes it backfires disastrously. the globally known example is the introduction of fines in an Israeli nursery, which was done on the recommendation of an economist who said, you've got a problem of people bringing their kids late to the nursery, fine them if they do that. Right? When they introduced the fine, the number of people bringing their kids late exploded, because the fine was treated as a price. It took away the normative content of the action of bringing the child late. Finally, let me turn to a couple of applications of all this stuff to state effectiveness. After all, state effectiveness is what the Blavatnik School's really, really about. And so the first thing I'm going to look at is, how does the state get compliance with its requests and instructions? And this is only interesting if the state is trying to get you to do something that is not in your direct self-interest. If it's in your direct self-interest, the state doesn't need to tell you to do it. You can work it out yourself, thank you. Right? So this is only of interest where the state, for some reason, needs you to do something that is not in your own interest. How do we do it? Well, it's much easier if we can turn power into authority. There is a standard technique recommended globally for turning power into authority. It's called hold an election and win it. And we use that everywhere. I just come back from Africa overnight, which is why I'm a little bit woozy. But yesterday, a former minister of Somalia was telling me how the international community for the last 3 years has obsessed about getting an election in Somalia. They've never had one. According to him, people don't want one. If they have one, when they have one, there'll be a winner and a loser, which will be hugely divisive. But because the donors have the money, the politicians are more concerned to be legitimate in the eyes of the donors than in the eyes of their citizens. Right? So that's what he says. We've spent 3 years doing nothing else but focus on this impending election. We've wasted 3 years. Right? So that's the standard technique. A year ago, I had a very good student at Blavatnik School from Libya. He's in the Libyan government. They won a fair election. They've got legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. They haven't got easy compliance from Libyan citizens. So the standard hammer doesn't work in a lot of societies. What does work? Well, let's have a look how we actually get compliance. We use language. And here are 2 routes for getting low-cost compliance. This is the one that tries to persuade people that, as it were, black is white. Remember, this is an action which is not in your self-interest. Well, we could try and use narratives to persuade people that it is in their self-interest. Right? The really difficult one would be to say, it doesn't look as if it doesn't feel as if it's in your current interest, but really it is. Right? You'd have to be a really ace political liar to get away with that. But they exist. Right? Or you can try a little bit more subtle narrative which builds a chain of causality, maybe a false chain of causality, maybe a true one. Right? But think of a chain of causality which says, this isn't in your interest now, but lo and behold, this will lead to that, and that will lead to something else, and that will lead to something that's good for you. Right? So that's the self-interest route. It's hard work, right? Because fundamentally it's false. Right? Or you can try and generate an ought. And here's how you do it. You say, quite genuinely, there is a group benefit. You don't benefit, but the group does. Okay? And now, you say, remember, you identify as a member of this group. These people are you. We, you can use the word we, right? We as a whole will benefit. You build a norm of care within the group. That's pretty easy to do. It's very common. And what that then generates is a social ought. In the interests of society, you ought to do this. That's the norm. So you'll be under normative pressure to actually comply. And then, if you can perform the next miracle, the miracle of internalization, if you can get people to internalize that norm as their own value, you'll go from a social ought, you'll reinforce it with a moral ought. I know it's not in my current interest, but I know I must, to enact my own values, I must comply. That's the moral ought. So that's generating low-cost compliance. How do we do it? Well, one step is we need shared identity. If you don't have shared identity in a society, and there's a mismatch between the structure of power and the structure of identity, in my view, you've got a problem. So suppose you've got centralized power and fragmented identities, which is very common in a lot of societies. If you keep that structure, centralized power, fragmented identities, in my view, power doesn't turn into authority, even if you've won an election. You've then got three unappealing choices. One is you can force compliance. That's repression. That happens. Second possibility is you can try and force it, but you don't have enough force. That's conflict. And the third is you know you can't do it, and that's theatre. You just pretend. Everybody just pretends. You issue instructions that you know won't be complied with. People pretend to comply. Everybody's happy, except nothing happens. There's no compliance. Right? Repression, conflict, theatre, they're all awful. So if you want to avoid that, you've got to match the structure of identity with the structure of power. How do you do that? You either move identities up to power, which is what President Nyerere did over the years in Tanzania. He moved the structure of identities up from his 50 tribes up to a national identity. In Tanzania, people genuinely feel Tanzanian. Or you move power down to identity. That's called decentralization. It's what Kenya's doing now. It's what Britain recently did with Scotland. Highly successful societies which have fragmented identities have coped, have managed very, very well by decentralizing power to identity. That's Canada, Belgium, Switzerland. So that's the analysis of compliance using this sort of new technology, as it were. Let me close with another feature of state effectiveness. An effective state needs some effective public organizations. It doesn't need all the state apparatus to work, but there are some parts of the state apparatus that are absolutely vital. If these functions do not work, you haven't got any possibility of a functioning state. They are tax, law, army. You've got to be able to raise revenue. You've got to have the rule of law. You've got to have security. What's the standard toolkit for achieving that? What's the equivalent of hold an election when what we are trying to build is these effective organizations within the state? And the answer is training, training, training. That's the standard toolkit. For 50 years, it's been training, right? The discourse of capacity building. Train individuals. In fact, that was the other thing that the minister from Somalia said was, we can't get anything done because everybody's out of the country being trained. So what's reality? What's reality? We've had 50 years of that train, 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 and we've still got societies in which neither tax nor law nor security function. What's the alternative? And the alternative is there is a need, an irreducible need, to build motivated teams. Okay? Why do you need motivated teams? Because the motivation both gives you individual effort, but individual effort is not enough. All public organizations depend upon teamwork, and that means cooperation within a group of people. So you need to build motivated teams, not just trained individuals. For that, you need to change identities, because you need to get people to internalize the goals of the organization. That is, in fact, the heartland of identity economics. How do you get people to internalize the objectives of the organization by changing their identity? Let's close by thinking about taxation. So here's an example of tax collectors. My friend and colleague Boo tells me that in Sweden, the tax collectors are the most respected job in the whole society. I used to work on Madagascar, and in Madagascar, being a tax collector was the most desired job in the society. We knew that because there was one training school for tax collectors. You couldn't become one unless you went to the training school, train, train, train. And the bribe to get in to the training school, to get your kid in, was 50 times annual per capita income. So people really, really wanted to become tax inspectors in Madagascar. Right? Let's try and finish by just sketching how we could use the tools I've been talking about. So here's 3 networks, social networks, that a tax inspector will be in, whether they're in Sweden or in Madagascar. Okay? They'll be in a family network, they'll be in the network of their colleagues, they'll be in a larger network of community and society. Each of these things will generate those mental constructs. The identity, what's the identity of a tax collector? You know, maybe he or she is the breadwinner in the family. Colleagues, what's your identity vis-a-vis your colleagues, other tax inspectors? Well, Akerlof's key identity move is you've got to believe you're good at it. So I'm a good tax inspector. Of course, we've not said what it means to be a good tax inspector. We know what it means in Sweden. In Sweden, it means you are meticulous in applying the tax code. What does it mean to be a good tax collector in Madagascar? What does it mean when your colleagues say, when a young guy joins the tax inspectorate in Madagascar and they say, go and talk to old Joe. He knows a thing or two about really doing this job well. Right? Do they mean he really knows how to apply the rules meticulously? Perhaps not. Right? And finally, there's the wider society. Why, in Sweden, are tax inspectors the most respected profession in the whole society? Because there's a whole set of narratives around those tax inspectors which say, thanks to this group of tax inspectors, Sweden is able to have the finest public services on earth. Right? And then you think, what's the narrative going on in Madagascar? Right? So, first, you try and use these techniques to map out what the mental constructs look like. And then you think, what we need to get to, in Madagascar at least, is a different set of mental constructs held by tax inspectors. What does it take to get those mental constructs to change? And what we'll be driven back to is the bunch of policy toolkits that I sketched a few minutes ago. It's the new narratives, the new networks, the new norms, the new role models. We need a big push because these things are locally stable. So, I apologize for taking you into rather eccentric territory. I do feel I've lived down to my Dean's introduction in that I've managed to be quite eccentric. We're trying, a small group of us, to actually generate this revolution in economics from the classical economics, which just focuses on incentives, to a richer set of ideas which brings in modern social psychology. I think for many of the world's most pressing public policy problems, that's what we have to do. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. If you'd now like to join us all for drinks up one floor, you'll get a chance to talk with Sir Paul and with each other about the ideas of tonight. Thank you all for coming.